Celeste. It's a game. I've put a few hours into it, so I think it's only fair I try to do a challenge run of it. There are already many challenge runs of it on YouTube, so I want to do something that had never been done before. I came up with this idea a few years ago, and to this day there are still no videos on it. This video will cover the main 7 chapters, and the only goal is to reach the epilogue without a single diagonal dash. Before we get started, let's get some notes out of the way. The most important note is that we will not be allowed to do a single diagonal dash. While the definition of a diagonal dash may seem simple, it's important to clarify so there are no arguments over rules. In Celeste, one of the 3 main mechanics is dashing, which is done by pressing the dash button while holding a direction. For the purposes of this challenge, a diagonal dash will count as any time the dash button is pressed while holding in any of the 4 diagonal directions. Any other method of moving diagonally without pressing dash will not be counted. With that out of the way, the second note is that we will not be going for any collectibles unless they are required for the run. This means we will collect 0 strawberries and crystal hearts, and will only collect cassette tapes if they are required to save diagonal dashes. I may do later videos obtaining all the collectibles and completing all the additional chapters and sides, but this video is just about beating the game and reaching the epilogue. The third note is that I will mostly only explain the rooms that cause problems, as this video would be way too long if I explained every room. The fourth note is that the second half of this video had to be recorded a second time because my previous file didn't record right and just recorded as a static image in my desktop, as you can see. So if a timer in the top left of the footage looks off, that's why, in case you were wondering. The second recording was also slightly zoomed in, but I'm not re-recording this a third time because I have a life. Shocker, so you're just gonna have to live with it. The fifth note is that while I will use assist mode and show hitboxes to practice difficult and long rooms and test different strategies, each room will be beaten without them in order to make this a legitimate challenge run. And finally, while I will explain the mechanics and tech required in this video, I'm not going to go into too much detail because there are a million other videos that do a way better job than I could, and I assume most of the people who are watching a Celeste challenge run video already know most of the mechanics of Celeste. With all these notes out of the way, let's get on to the run. After starting a new file, we begin the prologue, which introduces us to our first 2 mechanics, jumping and climbing. These first 2 rooms won't cause any issues, and we can quickly make it to the third and final room, where we are going to be introduced to dashing. Oh. Really? We just started. Thankfully, by pausing and selecting Skip Cutscene, we can skip this required diagonal dash, allowing us to quickly move into our first real chapter, Forsaken City. This chapter is also very easy as it's the first main chapter in the game, so we won't run into any issues until we reach this room, but a quick wall jump allows us to make it over these spikes that look impossible to pass. This room here is also a little tight, but with a well-aimed dash to the right, we can easily continue to the end of the chapter. This isn't at all surprising, because this chapter can be completed without a single dash of any direction in order to earn the winged golden strawberry. The next chapter, Old Sight, starts out easy, allowing us to go down this well until we reach this room. Despite looking hard, the room is actually really easy, as is the next one, allowing us to proceed to the mirror. After shattering the mirror, the dream blocks get unlocked, which could present a problem for us later. Dream blocks are used by dashing into them, meaning that if we ever run into a room that requires us to dash diagonally in order to move through them, we could have a problem on our hands. Despite this ominous fact, we can proceed back up the well until we get to this dream block. You're supposed to dash diagonally up left in order to reach this upper area, but we can actually just climb onto it before dashing left in order to get up. Oh no. This is what I was talking about when I said we might run into a room that requires us to dash diagonally through a dream block. Hitting a wall in a dream block kills you, which means this room requires not 1, but 2 diagonal dashes. But don't give up hope yet, there may be a way out of this. While this is the only way to beat the A side of the chapter, beating the B side of a chapter also unlocks the next one. By restarting the chapter and going back to the bottom of the well after shattering the mirror, we can use this dream block to reach the cassette room. Collecting this cassette allows us to unlock the B side, and thankfully this room is really easy. While the B side will definitely be more challenging, we may be able to beat it without any diagonal dashes, so it's at least worth a try. Exiting the chapter and entering the B side, you can immediately see what I meant when I said that these rooms will be much harder. These rooms have much less margin for error, meaning it's very likely we'll get stuck here. Despite this, however, we're able to easily make it past the first checkpoint. Maybe this won't be so bad after all. Why does this keep happening? Unfortunately, just like the A side, the dream block requires a diagonal dash, as in order to open the door we need all 3 keys, and we can't get back down without it. If we try to go straight down, we'll hit the wall, which kills us. Well, that's it, we failed. But I don't want to end this video on a failure, especially since it would only be like 5 minutes long, so we're going to change the video from, can you beat Celeste without diagonal dashes, to, how many diagonal dashes does it take to beat Celeste? This nice counter will be added to the bottom left, and it will increase for every diagonal dash. With that being said, we're going to continue with the B side, since if there are no more required diagonal dashes, we can still save one from the A side. Moving into the next room. Again? I think it's safe to say that dream blocks are the biggest enemy of the run. Hopefully we don't run into many more of them in the rest of the game. Since this room also requires a diagonal dash, we're going to reset the counter and return to the A side, as we're far more likely to run into problems in the B side, but if we get stuck in the A side we can come back. Return to the A side, we make our way back to the room that ruined our dreams, and add 2 dashes to the counter. That hurts. After this room though, despite having to deal with many more dream blocks, there are no more problems worth noting, allowing us to wake up from our dream. Wait, it was all a dream? I'm kidding, but if only. After waking up, we can easily run to the right and finish the chapter. Moving on to chapter 3, we're able to easily grab the key and ring the bell when we're introduced to one of the worst mechanics for a run like this, cycles. Due to the nature of the dust bunnies in the level constantly moving, we have to be very smart and thoughtful when planning our route through each room, because we can't just take our time. Our lack of mobility also is going to make it much harder to avoid them, which is concerning since there'll very likely be a room that requires us to use a diagonal in order to avoid one of their cycles. We have no problems until reaching this room here, which requires some tight timings and precise dashes to make it to the other side. Continuing on to the next checkpoint, we have a choice in which route to take. The order you choose does matter, as doing the paths in different orders results in some blocks being removed, making some routes much harder or downright impossible. I personally did down, then right, then up, which correlates to the brown, purple, and green buttons respectively. I didn't run into many problems except for this first room to the right, requiring a very tight up dash, but the order has no effect on this room. You're welcome to try your own order, but the one I used worked just fine and didn't make any of the rooms harder than usual, so that's what I recommend. After finishing all 3 paths and removing all the mess, we can simply pick up the key and make our way to the elevator shaft. We're able to progress through a few more difficult rooms until reaching this one. Even with perfect execution, this room would still require at least 1 or 2 diagonal dashes, so instead of trying to get the perfect run through it, we're just going to move on to the B side. This tape is also easy to collect, being located just a few rooms earlier and having an easy cassette room, allowing us to try the B side. Hopefully we don't have a repeat of chapter 2. In the B side, we don't run into any issues until this room, where I thought it was impossible to reach this platform without a diagonal dash. However, after slowing it down, I realized with a perfectly timed dash up, it's just barely possible, allowing this run to continue. After completing this room at normal speed, we can make it to the next problematic room. We're meant to diagonal dash between these dust bunnies, but a very precise dash makes it possible to do it without. You actually have to do this twice, but after doing that you can make it onto the final portion of the chapter, the Oshiro chase. This room here is tricky, requiring us to crouch under the first cycle before quickly dashing to the end to avoid Oshiro. The next few rooms, however, are actually very easy until we reach this room with a lot of dash crystals, which requires us to dash very precisely in order to make it to the end while avoiding Oshiro and not using up all of the crystals. The next room is easy, allowing us to reach the last room in the chapter, being the hardest we've seen so far. The first half of this room is already difficult, and the last wall of dust bunnies seems just barely too tall to pass. After testing theories and attempting to pass it for around 15 minutes, I finally realized that a precise up dash allowed you to pass it, allowing for us to collect the heart and move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 introduces us to every Celeste player's favorite mechanic, wind. While it won't cause any obvious issues like the dream blocks and the cycles do, it's definitely going to make it a lot harder to fight against the wind with our limited mobility. Shortly after entering this chapter, we get introduced to bubbles, which are a hotly contested issue in runs like these. Some people, like me, argue that since they don't require a dash input, they don't count, but some argue that since you can perform tech like supers and hypers off of them, they do count. After doing a good bit of research and asking some members of the Celeste Reddit and Discord, I discovered a few things. First, you need to be familiar with the concept of a winged strawberry. A winged strawberry is a form of strawberry that flies away when you dash, making it required to reach it without dashing a single time. I made a test room here with a bubble and a winged strawberry and quickly found out that bubbles do not activate winged strawberries, meaning they're not considered a dash. I also learned that apparently the way the game is coded, it counts all your dashes, but bubbles are not counted in that total, meaning that according to the game's code, they do not count. Hopefully this will settle the bubble debate for good, and we can focus on just completing hard runs instead of arguing over semantics all the time. Now that we know this, we're free to use bubbles in any direction, but feel free to leave your arguments in the comments, because I'd love to hear some other people's perspectives on this issue. Now that that's settled, we can proceed with the chapter. We have no problems until this room here, which requires an incredibly precise updash to barely avoid the spikes while collecting the key. Our next problematic room doesn't come until we reach the second checkpoint, where our dash just barely isn't enough to get us across this strong wind. We're actually going to need to learn a new mechanic called supers. Supers are performed by dashing straight on the ground and then jumping shortly after, granting you a large amount of forward speed. By timing our jump right, we can even regain our dash, allowing us to make it to the platform even in a heavy wind. Supers will be very helpful for this run, as they allow us to get a distance and the height from a diagonal dash, since you can super to the right and then dash up in order to replicate that same amount of distance and momentum. Our next difficult room comes just before the final checkpoint, where we can avoid this bubble on the left that's just out of reach by grabbing this wall and jumping into the third bubble when the wind comes. The rest of the chapter is easy until the final room, which just requires a tight dash to the right to finish the chapter. And now it's time for the worst chapter in the entire game, Mirror Temple. This chapter is awful from beginning to end, with the first half being almost like a maze, and the second half containing some of the worst mechanics in the game, being Seekers and Crystal Theo. We can easily progress until this room, where we skip getting the key with this hidden bubble. I'm unsure if the key route requires any diagonal dashes, but I hate this level so much that I'm just trying to skip as much of it as possible. Speaking of which, the main speedrun skip of this level involves performing a reverse super on this platform before dashing to the other side. I spent 15 whole minutes here in my first recording, and another 5 minutes in my second, but it's just barely impossible. This really goes to show that I'm so committed to hating this chapter that I'm willing to spend 20 minutes trying to skip it when it would take way less than that just to beat it. The rooms that are on the key paths that we have to collect because we can't do the skip aren't very challenging, except for this one room which requires a tight upward dash. After collecting both keys, we can progress to the final part of the chapter, being the Crystal Theo section. While this section isn't very hard, it's incredibly annoying, especially due to a lack of mobility, making avoiding these Seekers much harder. Despite this, we don't run into any major problems, making this the easiest yet most annoying chapter yet. Chapter 6 quickly introduces us to feathers, which similar to bubbles don't count as dashes. One thing about this chapter that's important to note is that there are multiple paths, and the one taken can affect the difficulty of the run. I always took a top path when given the choice, and I didn't check the bottom paths, but I can guarantee you the top paths worked just fine and I didn't run into a single issue. This simplicity continues through most of the chapter, and the only room worth noting is this swimming room. Swimming doesn't count, but just for fun I decided to complete it without diagonal swimming. I don't recommend it since it wasn't fun at all, but if you really hate yourself and have nothing better to do, go right ahead. The only room in this chapter actually worth noting for its difficulty is the final room of the boss fight, requiring a somewhat tight upward dash in order to clear it. It's interesting, because despite the chapters becoming much harder, this challenge is becoming easier. The first chapters had a large amount of problematic rooms, and had many spots that I thought the run would be over, while the last couple have barely had anything worth noting. This is likely due to the reliance on the new mechanics and gimmicks in the later chapters, as opposed to the tight platforming focus in the first few while you're still learning how to play the game. But make no mistake, the summit is the hardest chapter in the entire run, making for the perfect climax. How many more diagonal dashes will it take? Let's find out. The Summit is a very interesting chapter, as it contains rooms based off of each of the previous 6 chapters, followed by 30 uniquely themed flags. The main mechanic in this chapter is our second dash, giving us many more options when tackling tricky rooms. The Chapter 6 section of this doesn't have any particularly difficult rooms, allowing us to proceed to the 500 meter checkpoint based off of Chapter 1. The only room worth noting in this checkpoint is this one, where 2 upward dashes give us the distance we need. While these first couple checkpoints have been very easy, it's about to get much worse. Say hello to our old friend, Dream Blocks. Have you missed them? Me neither. Despite this, shockingly there are no major problems. Maybe I was wrong about the Dream Blocks. Never mind, I hate Dream Blocks. Even worse, we can't even try the B-side because you can't collect it until the Chapter 3 section. I was fully ready to give up and add one to the dash counter, but I decided to try one last thing, and then this happened. To understand what just happened, you need to learn about demo dashes. By dashing down and then changing the direction within 1/20th of a second, you can perform a dash while crouched, shrinking your hitbox substantially. Or you can just bind it to a button like I did. The shrinked hitbox makes this dash barely possible, allowing us to finish the rest of the checkpoint with ease and say goodbye to Dream Blocks for good. Moving on to the next section themed around Chapter 3, the only difficult room is this one, requiring a very precise setup in order to get the key. I spent about 5 minutes finding it, and you might be able to find a more efficient one, but this is the way I found it to work. The next section, despite the wind, is also very easy, allowing us to return to Pain and Suffering. Similar to the Chapter 3 checkpoint, there's only one room worth noting, but it's likely the hardest room in the entire run so far. I initially thought you needed to precisely demo dash between these spikes, but even that wouldn't give you the height you need. After a while theorizing, I finally realized that the room was barely possible for a precise dash to the right followed by a dash up. After this room, we can easily make it to the final section with only 30 flags standing between us and the end of the run. The first few flags are actually very easy, and the first difficult one is this one, requiring some tight dashes to make it to the end with the limited crystals provided. Flag 22 is also slightly difficult, requiring wall jumps and upwards dashes to clear it. Flag 20 is the hardest yet, requiring tight dashes to reach this crumbling platform. Despite this, it's quickly dethroned by Flag 17, which I initially didn't think was possible. It requires 2 tight upward dashes and a pixel-perfect dash to the right, making it incredibly difficult and annoying. Flag 13 is similarly tight, but not nearly as bad. Flags 11 and 10 are also both very hard, requiring more precise upwards dashes, with 11 requiring an upwards demo dash to avoid these spikes. Flag 5 also requires a precise demo dash, and after that the only difficult flag is 2, requiring a pixel-perfect sequence of dashes to make it onto this ledge. After that, we can easily climb our way to the top of the mountain. Reaching the epilogue, we can find out that after 3 hours, 42 minutes, 601 deaths, and 0 strawberries, you can beat Celeste with only 2 diagonal dashes. It's a great accomplishment, but it's kinda sad. If it wasn't for that single room, this run would be possible without a single diagonal. Desperate to shave off these last 2 dashes, I posted my problem on both the Celeste Reddit and Discord, where I was quickly told there was nothing that could be done. I was also shown a spreadsheet made by a community member who had tried this challenge a long time ago, but the numbers didn't quite match mine. I could only assume the run was done while counting the bubbles as dashes, since only chapters 4 and 7, which are the only ones with bubbles, had any dashes added to the counter, but I'm not sure. It was cool to see I wasn't the only one crazy enough to try this, but I'm glad we were able to shave even more dashes off the counter. And who knows, maybe in 5 years a revolutionary trick allowing us to pass this room will be found. But for now, that's where the run sits. Until I make another video, just you wait. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you're still here and enjoyed the video, please subscribe, because I'll likely start working on a sequel video attempting to collect all the berries, hearts, and cassettes in the near future. Bye!